Okay, this shows an underpainting for a painting. This is basically the first step. Um, I'm working here from sketches and from finished watercolor I already did of this painting. And it did that so it would go more quickly and not be as boring. Um, so this is how I usually work. Uh, Start off with white just to get paint down and sort of low stress, sort of easy. Um, but you do need to get the paint down anyway, and it gives you something to sort of blend into and gets things started. You see there on the right is I think it's a bead jewelry tray. It's $2 from Michaels, and I like to use that for underpainting or live painting or quick paintings because it keeps the paint separate and it keeps them wet, and you can close the lid, and then they don't dry out very fast. Um, and I just loaded up with basically the different varieties of primary colors, neutral colors, and white. You see on the left there's 3 different kinds of white, and there's really no reason for that other than I need that much white typically, and rather than just put white, it's that what is there is a gesso, and then the next one is milky white, and then the third one down is titanium white, and below that is metallic gold, which sort of functions as a light neutral a lot of time. It's just with sort of to alleviate boredom. And so I like to work in this sort of iterative, recursive method. I'm not really very good at drawing or planning, but I sort of started out in as a computer engineer, and this is and I did a lot of work in imaging and computer vision and data compression, data storage, and so a lot of this process is informed by that, where it's basically successive refinements. And so really the trick is just to get started, and the image you want to produce basically, and so you put white in the general area and then switch to a contrasting color, black, sort of block in where the darks are going to be, and cycle back and forth. It'll be dark light, and I've done this actually just using black and white and a mid-tone, like a raw umber, but it's actually it's more fun, I guess, to just use a full palette, because these are all sort of the cheapest possible acrylics, and they're all the same price, and there's no real advantage to using plain white and plain black. So I basically work from a full color palette, and don't really worry too much about the color accuracy. It's mostly just for, none of this is going to show up in the final painting. It's all just sketches and guidelines basically. But yeah, maybe some of it will show through, so it's always good to have, there's some advantage, I guess, to using full color. But mainly it's just for me. It's just so it looks like something when I'm doing it. This general process is that you would, create this sketch underpainting, and then go over with successive layers. And usually I'd go, a couple passes with sort of, proper color, and then use sort of semi-transparent glazes to sort of further refine. So it's a refining process in terms of the shapes, the geography of it, but also in terms of the colors and the tones and the values. And it's basically just putting something down and then moving it around or adjusting it towards what it should be. So it's, and just keep doing that process. By the time it's done, I figure I'd probably put 40 or 50 layers of paint on something. And that's just the way I work, I guess. That brush right there, if you're curious, is a Simply Simmons. It's a 1-inch wash watercolor brush. It's sort of a soft synthetic. This canvas is it's a drop cloth. It's a painting drop cloth, which is sort of a 70-30 polyester cotton blend, and it ends up being, it's pretty nice. It works out. It's sort of like linen, like Belgian linen, but it's a lot cheaper. And I stretch these over pine dimensional lumber. They sort of knock the corners off so it doesn't, so it stays away from the canvas. And then it's primed with cheap. I go to the hardware store and buy the whatever they have, the reject gallons of paint, and so I prime the canvas with that. Usually a couple coats, and that sort of seals it and stops it from just absorbing the expensive paint. And then usually 1 or 2 layers of gesso, just to sort of get an even working surface. And that's where this video started, with that sort of canvas. The subject here is there's a figure drawing group that meets at a bar near me, and this is the sketches I did for this were based on one of those. I did a watercolor of it, and it worked out pretty well. So, and one of the nice things about working this way, that's sort of a nice side effect, is that through the course of putting all the layers of paint on, you actually get a succession of depth. So you'll get brush strokes building on top of each other, and sometimes they're not exactly where they should be, but the nice side effect there is that when you get a finished painting, what you end up with is sort of an impasto look, but that is sort of moving around the final shapes. So you have a sort of a slight difference, sort of a discordance or a beating between where the brush strokes all seem to be and where the colors are. And some of that prints through. But anyway, that's actually just a nice side effect. I guess you could see that as being a problem, but I think for the way I work, that ends up making it look a little bit more vibrant and a little more interesting. I'm certainly not trying for realistic or neat or and that's luckily, this is kind of based on the photography that I do, and the photographs look like this. Like, it's, I don't know why. It's just, that's always been what my output looks like. It's kind of blurry or chaotic or pixelated, or I don't know really what it is. But there's not a lot of accuracy in terms of shape or placement or relation or color, but that's something I spent 20-30 years trying to get into my photography. So the fact that it means it's easier to paint is kind of again a nice side effect. I guess one thing that's sort of happening here is I just spent 3 or 4 months learning how to paint watercolors, and so that had a lot. That taught me, that sort of informed a different technique in terms of being aware of brush strokes and where they're going to end up. But the main thing was just a deep awareness of pigments, all the different types of pigments that go into these paints and how they behave, and which ones look like what, and how they interact with each other, which ones are transparent, which ones are more opaque, and of course, not really of interest to a final painting, but there's a lot of issues with how expensive certain ones are, and things like that. But basically everything that's in this palette right now is cheap paint. But most of it, just recently I spent about 2 days on the internet looking up pigment numbers, and these are all actually good cheap paints that have pretty nice pigments. Like, for instance, that red that just went down is a pyrrole red, which, and the nicer brands like Golden or Winsor Newton, that's one of their like Series 8 paints. It's the most expensive one, but I found this, and it's Amsterdam Basics. But it's the same pigment, and it's diluted compared to sort of artist acrylics, but for this part of the process, that's totally unimportant. I mean, what's important right now is sort of bulk of paint, trying to build up depth and brush strokes and so on. So, it's good. It's actually good to use the cheap paint here, because using the more expensive paint, it would be thicker and it wouldn't flow out as easily, and it'd take forever to cover this canvas. And I've done that, but it ends up looking kind of choppy. It helps to sort of, and who knows, this probably, my lack of education is probably telling here, but there's probably some theory about this in oil painting, in terms of putting down these broader, thinner, sketchy parts first. And again, that's what this is. I mean, the end of this video is still that sort of first sketchy layer. So it's starting to look like something. You can kind of tell. Like right now, I'm painting on sort of. This is a woman reclining on a chaise lounge, looking in a mirror. So the mirror is that thing on the left side, right just there. The woman's head is, sort of middle left upper next to the mirror, and then sort of reclining with her dress flowing out to the right hand side. The bottom is actually was just a cloth over a platform on the stage, but it looks like a couch. And there's a little vase to the left of her face with flowers right in front of her face, and there's this matching vase over on the right hand side. That band of white along the right edge is actually a pillar that was sort of wrapped in a cloth. She had sort of mixed blonde hair with a bright yellow-green stripe down the side, and bunny ears. So that's sort of what you're seeing. She's wearing bunny ears, and she had bows on both her arms and around her neck. So there's bright white bands there, and then there's sort of a metallic sheen silk fabric on a couple of platforms right in front of her, basically, and one off to the right. And there's a little bowl of fruit there, sort of below her right hand. The left is working at it. The mirror basically looked black with a gold frame around it, but at this point it's just a little oval there. I guess there's another one with columns on the left, which is sort of just off to the left of the picture. You can kind of see, like, for instance, there's a sort of a mix of blue, black, and white that I sort of slapped over various places, which ultimately will hardly show, but just in terms of composition, but also I think in terms of the final look, just having that underneath what is ultimately just going to be white, sort of plaster white, in the little spots where you miss it out, it's gonna it puts that dark underneath it, which gives it sort of depth and movement. And that's actually at this point of this painting, there's sort of two things going on in my head. One is make sure you sort of finish all the canvas, and pretty soon here there starts to be sort of just rapid brush strokes to sort of cover stuff. But so part of it is just making sure, okay, what part of the canvas hasn't been covered yet? That's what needs to be addressed. But the other thing is sort of starting to correct things in place in terms of their geography. Certainly not worrying about color much at all. In fact, at this point, almost every color I put on is just something that I can see in contrast to what it's going over. So it might be a totally wrong color, just so I can see where the paint's going down. And again, it's probably kind of a stupid way to work, but it works with the way I work. I'm not really trained as a painter or really as an artist of any kind. Spent a long time in school for engineering, and it helps, I guess, but it's not traditional. So I guess what I'm talking about probably doesn't apply to most people. um, but to talk about some of the pigments, I guess the sort of pinky color there is a magenta, which is a quinacridone fast pink, which is a pigment red 122, and I think that's my favorite color. It you can't really see it on on an image like this, but in person it sort of vibrates and glows, and it's not like any other color. And having it's well, it's the magenta in inkjet printers. That's so it kind of gives you a vibrant lifelikeness that you don't see in a lot of painting. And I don't know why it's not a particularly new color, but there you go. And the only reason I'm using that here is because I did find sort of super cheap student paint that used that pigment. That, and then there's a couple other pigments that I'm not using at this stage because they're real expensive artists pigments. One's nickel azo yellow, which is pigment yellow 150, and that. I mean, what's just particularly neat about that color is if you look at it in the tube, if you open it up in the store, it just looks like mud or baby diarrhea or something. It's very unimpressive, and even if you just brush it out, it doesn't look like much. But if you spread it so it reaches sort of a transparency, it just makes everything sort of, you can I save it to the end and just sort of smear it on things. Really, it just makes things sort of pop and come alive, and it's just a warm, encompassing yellow. It just looks like warm sunshine on a carpet, with a cat lying in it or something. So that's another one. And I think the third sort of magic pigment is it's a golden, it's quinacridone burnt orange. It's called quinacridone nickel azo yellow, and it's basically nickel azo yellow plus a quinacridone sort of rust red, and I think it's pigment red 206. But anyway, but there's something about I've tried these paints these pigments from other brands, and they don't really work. So there's something about the way Golden formulates them, that they just have this really controllable sort of transparency and vibrancy. I don't know what it is. They're very expensive. But anyway, so this one I'm not using here. Otherwise I would. But they're just too expensive to glom on like this. So I usually save those to the last stage of the painting where you can see it. And before I would, the pink, I would have done that too, but now I have a cheap version. So that's on her waistband, and there's a little bit of tinting her skin and her chest and her face. And I guess along those lines, using the metallic gold, like for instance, right now, obviously the mirror frame, which is actually gold, but also her hair and some of her skin and some of the highlights on the dress and actually a little bit of the highlighting on the bases at this point, are all done with a metallic gold, which is basically a mica flake and yellow of some sort. But it seems like a cheat, but it makes things pop, and if you use it right, it doesn't look like it's metallic gold. It just makes the painting more luminous and more vibrant. So I enjoy doing that. I guess it's getting to the point where you can kind of see some stuff. So what's going on here? Behind her is actually a set of. I think the theme of the night was that she was an artist. So behind her is a bunch of life drawings, sort of faded yellow, old sketch paper with charcoal drawings on it and so forth. So it's already, that's why that area is starting to look kind of brushed over. It's meant to recede back and be out of focus, but still have that sort of matte non-reflectiveness that the paper gives you. And that's sort of what's going on in general here. Like the silk parts now look, they're basically, there's a sort of a three-tone paint effect going on there, which sort of approximates the silk. There's sort of the bright primaries where the cloth she's sitting on is. Her skin tone's approximately right, and her arms are basically drawn in, as placeholders. And one of the things that isn't quite right, I guess, is that the darks aren't quite. I would like to have the darks a little better mapped out. So basically, come in here with some black and hit all those. But they're not quite right. But it doesn't matter. That'll be the sort of next stage. Stage after this is going to be basically another pass of this. Just let this dry and then go over it again. And again, that's sort of the way I have to work. There's never a point where anything is committed. There's never a point where anything's fixed. It's just keep iterating until it's right. And as time goes on, the brushes get smaller. The pace gets slower, and it gets more detailed and refined. But really, the process doesn't change. It's just keep refining, keep refining. And one thing, I don't know if anybody cares, but every once in a while you see me sort of cleaning the brush on the sides, and this is sort of an inch and a half deep gallery wrap, and I do just kind of clean the brush off every once in a while, which serves to clean the brush off, since having to stop and rinse it out or whatever. But it also, by doing that process over the course of all the iterations, you end up painting the sides so that they match. Just sort of organically it happens, which is nice. And then right here is sort of whenever I finish up one of these early layers, I like to make sure there's nothing too lumpy or peaky. So I'll basically just do this and skim over everything, sort of just knocking everything down, which serves to flatten it out so there's no abnormalities in the paint, which also makes the thing dry faster, or at least dry evenly. But it also kind of gives it knocks away any sort of preciousness or particularness about the details. It blurs everything out, which is it kind of looks neat, but it also stops me from fixating on, that part looks good, so I don't want to touch that. Because if you do that, then you run into trouble, because you put 15-20 layers on another part of the painting and you leave one area flat, and it ends up looking wrong, so you have to fix it anyway. So basically that sort of brushing over just it's a sort of, it serves a few purposes. At this point, I think what I'm doing is trying to make sure that the dress and the other sort of high white highlight things are actually white, because even though later I'll go in and tint them over, it's nice to just sort of force the whites to be white, so that when you put the subtle colors over it, you're not fighting, you're not trying to fight with some darker color underneath. And same with the pure darks. So that's sort of the goal.